Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Please let us know where you are watching because we are about to talk about something that makes no sense. This happened in the Misty Mountains of North Carolina in the late 1800s. A whole family disappeared, leaving only a diary behind. But this wasn't just any diary. Even though it wasn't found for decades, the confessions, secrets, and revelations in it were so dark that the document might have been sealed forever by the authorities. In Watauga County, which is in the northwest corner of North Carolina and is mostly mountains, the Holloway family lived on a large private property. In 1899, the land was still dealing with the effects of the war. Deep scars from a war that ended a little more than 30 years ago. The roads were bad, and it took a long time to talk to other people. Many families lived in places that were almost cut off from the rest of the world. The Holloways owned land and were a family that, at least on the outside, kept some respectability in the area. The land was on the edge of a thick forest, close to a river that cut through the valley. In the winter, fog came down from the mountains and covered everything, making the scenery look almost ghostly. The closest neighbors lived many miles away, and they rarely came over. The family was made up of the head of the household, his wife, and a distant relative who had moved there after losing everything in a fire in another county. At least, not in public. No one thought anything was wrong. Some people said things. In small towns, there are always rumors going around. People said that in the early morning, strange lights were seen on the property and sounds came from the house when no one should have been there. They also said that the patriarch had a terrible temper and that his wife was rarely seen in town. But until something real happens, rumors are just that, rumors. The family then just disappeared in the spring of 1900. No one said goodbye. There was no sale of the house. There were no letters that told what happened to them. They were one day. That house was empty the next day. It was as quiet as if the family had never been there. The county police were told, but there weren't many investigations going on at the time, and the case quickly went cold. The land was thought to have been left empty, and nature slowly took back what was hers. The roof caved in, the windows broke, and the house fell apart. Years went by. The story about the hallway was just another local legend until 1934, when a group of workers were sent to get the land ready for a new building by clearing it out. When they were clearing the area, they found something buried under the rubble of the old library, a rusty metal box that is locked. It was wrapped in old leather inside. The document had a lot of pages and was written in small, shaky handwriting. Some spots had lost their ink, but most of the text could still be read, and what was there was too disturbing to ignore. People from Watauga County reading the first few pages. They knew what they were looking at wasn't just a family record. Something was said, maybe a curse. The diary started out in a good way. There are records of events, notes about the weather, and shopping lists made in town. The tone changed as the pages went on, though. The writing got darker, more personal, and more open. The author of the diary, whose identity is still being questioned, began to write about problems in the family, including fights that got physical and secrets that no one could tell. Revealed, and then the mention of a pact, which no one saw coming. As the text said, a deal was made out of desperation, a promise was made under duress, and something was agreed to that turned out to be very bad. The diary wrote about visits at night, beings that were not human, and choices that changed the lives of everyone in the house. Names were not clear. There were no exact dates given. Instead, scary, vague descriptions of events that didn't seem possible were given with a disturbing sense of conviction. The police tried to make sure of the facts. They looked through county records, court records, and old newspapers, but didn't find much. There was a family called Holloway. That much was certain, but Almost everything about them had been erased from public record, as if they had been removed on purpose. The fact that so little was known about them made the diary even more disturbing. The diary had information that no one could have made up. It correctly described the house's interior architecture, talked about the names of real local business owners and weather events that were reported in local newspapers. All of this made the document seem more real, but it also brought up a troubling question. What about the darker parts if the everyday details were true? One of the most interesting entries was about distant relatives who came to visit the estate. A man who had lost everything and was in pain was described in the text. But the way this arrival was described made it sound like he wasn't just looking for a place to stay. There was more, Anne. There was an old debt or favor that had to be paid back. People talked in whispers at night, signed papers by candlelight, and felt more and more like something bad was happening, according to the diary. In 1934, investigators tried to find out who this relative was. They looked through state records of fires, death certificates, and church records. They found some hints, but nothing that proved it for sure. In 1898, there was talk of a terrible fire in Caldwell County that destroyed many homes. Some, the victims, were never found. Others just vanished after the disaster. Could this be what brought the family member to the Hollways? No one could say for sure. It was the order of events in the diary that made it even scarier. The first entries came a long time apart, sometimes weeks. But as the year 1899 came to a close, the entries came more often almost every day, and the content changed a lot. The author started writing about strange things that happened to them, things that move at night and doors that open by. Themselves, sounds coming from the family's storage area in the basement, where they kept tools and supplies. One very disturbing entry, from November 1899, talked about something that was found in the basement. It looked like the author was writing quickly or under a lot of emotional stress because the text was broken up. It talked about something that shouldn't have been there that was hidden under the floorboards. No clear details were given about what was found, but everyone was shocked and horrified. The author talked about how important it was to keep it a secret, about being afraid that someone would find out, and about how things could not be undone. The workers who found the diary also looked around what was left of the property. Over time, the basement had fallen apart, but some parts could still be reached. They said they found old tools, empty barrels, and a stone building that looked like it had been used as a pantry, but the diary entries didn't make sense. In 1899, no physical proof of anything had been found in that basement. The people in the area responded with. When word got out about the diary, people had a range of emotions. Others who lived there longer remembered stories their grandparents had told them about the Hollways. They said that people didn't trust or respect the family, and that there was something wrong with the house that no one wanted to talk about. Others said it was all just superstition, saying that whole families often went missing back then, especially in rural areas. But there was one thing that everyone couldn't miss. In the very last entry of one of the diaries, from March 1900, the author talked about a choice or decision that had to be made. The writing was mysterious and almost poetic. It talked about paths that split off, doors that could never be closed again, and the price of keeping secrets hidden. The diary ended all of a sudden. There was no farewell. What was going on? There was nothing but a blank page and more blank pages, like the author had stopped writing in the middle of a thought. The authorities looked at a number of theories. Maybe the family had run away from debtors. It's possible that they were doing something illegal and needed to get away quickly. Maybe something terrible had happened on the property, and the people who were still alive left everything because they were afraid or felt guilty. But none of these ideas fully explained what was written in the diary, or why there was no record of what happened to the people who wrote it. The document was indexed and stored, but access to it was limited for many years. Researchers with special permissions were the only ones who could look at it. There wasn't a formal ban, but everyone knew that the content was too private for public viewing. Moving around. Some historians who read the diary said it made them feel uncomfortable, as if the words had a weight that went beyond what they said and meant. Journalists and local historians tried to piece together the Holloway family's story from other sources in the years after the diary was found. They went to old cemeteries in the area to find tombstones with the last name on them. They found some, but the dates didn't match. They talked to people who were related to people who lived in Watauga County in the late 1800s, hoping to find memories that had been passed down from one generation to the next. They found pieces of stories that were not finished and left more questions than answers. A retired merchant said that his grandfather ran a store in the town closest to the Holloway estate, and that he had heard that the family bought supplies in strange amounts. They would sometimes buy enough food for a month. They would sometimes come in once a week for certain things. Also, the grandfather said that it was unusual for the time that Patriarch never took credit cards and always paid in cash. Most farmers kept accounts at stores and paid them back after the harvest, but the Holleys didn't. It was like they didn't want to be connected to the community in any way. Records from the nearby Methodist church gave us another clue. In 1898, it was said that the Holloway's wife went to Sunday services for a few months, but then she stopped going. In his records at the time, the pastor wrote that he tried to see her at the house, but was not allowed to enter. The head of the family greeted him politely but firmly at the door and told him that the family would rather be alone. This was the last time that the Holloways were known to have talked to a religious building in the area. There were also parts of the diary that seemed to talk about deep-seated problems inside the person writing it. People talked about fighting over inheritance, land that had belonged to older generations, and promises made by ancestors that were now being broken. The writing suggested that the family had a historical burden that had been passed down through the generations and could not be ignored or abandoned. It felt like they were stuck in a plan that started before they were even born. One theory that researchers had a lot of disagreements about was the idea that the family might have been involved in land disputes. There were a lot of different claims to land in North Carolina, especially after the Civil War. A lot of families lost things, and some got them in questionable ways. Land records showed that the Holloway property had been owned by different people several times in the 1800s. Each time, there were legal disputes that were never fully settled. But there was more in the diary than just disagreements about money. The author wrote about ancestral guilt, sins that could not be forgiven, and how heavy it is to carry a bad last name. These thoughts pointed to a deep psychological aspect, maybe even a family obsession with redemption or atonement, as if everyone in the family believed in it. They felt responsible for mistakes their ancestors made, even though they weren't directly to blame for them. At that time, winters in North Carolina were very harsh, and being alone could have a huge effect on a person's mental health. Historians have written about many examples of families who lived on remote properties for months without talking to anyone else and developed unhealthy relationships within themselves. Loneliness, the difficulties of living in the country, and the lack of community. Support made places where conflict and emotional crisis were likely to happen. The diary showed how alone she felt. Long parts talked about how quiet the forest was, how heavy the snow was on the roof, and how they felt cut off from everyone else. The author wrote about never-ending nights when the only sound was the wind howling through the trees and dull days when the sun barely broke through the fog. This constant feeling of being alone definitely contributed to the entry's more and more sad tone. But most interesting, that's how the diary went back and forth between normal and strange events. On one page, the daily tasks of fixing fences and milking cows were explained. The next one got deep into philosophical thoughts about fate and free will. It seemed like two different people were writing, or the author was torn between wanting to keep things normal and wanting to share spooky thoughts that no one else could understand. There was permission for a history professor at the University of North Carolina to study the diary in great detail. He looked at the document for months, comparing the handwriting and studying the paper and ink that were used to try to figure out exactly when things happened. He came to a cautious conclusion. There was truth in the diary. It really did come from the time period given, but it was impossible to be sure that the events it talked about were true. It might be a record of facts. It might be made up. On the other hand, it might be a mix of reality and trickery. The professor also saw something strange. In some of the later entries, words were crossed out. Sentences were started but not finished, and the margins were full of scribbles that I couldn't understand. There were times when it seemed like the author wasn't sure what to say or what to hide. Some pages had marks on them that might have been tears or just the wear and tear of time. But the uneven wear and tear on the paper suggested that the diary had been handled many times, as if the author kept going back to the same pages and reading them again, maybe feeling bad about what they had written, what he wrote. The estate of Holloway was never rebuilt. After the diary was found, several attempts were made to buy the land, but none of them were successful. Potential buyers pulled out without giving a good reason. Some people said the land wasn't good for farming. Some people said the location was inconvenient. But people in the area had their own ideas. People said the land had a bad reputation, and even if the reputation isn't true, it can be enough to make people leave. Over the years, the forest took back the land. The house has. The foundations had grown too tall. Forgotten in the brush, the old fences were falling apart. The history buffs were the only ones who could tell you where the property started and ended. For people who didn't know what was going on, it looked like any other dense forest in the North Carolina mountains. Nature has a way of getting rid of human marks, and this time it looked like it was doing it very quickly. The diary talked about a well in the back of the property. From the notes, I could tell it was deep and had water all year. Useful for a farm that is hard to reach. In one of the most mysterious parts of the document, though, it talked about throwing something into that well that had to be kept secret. The text was meant to be vague. It only used the word evidence without saying what it meant. In 1934, when workers were exploring the area, they tried to find the well but were not able to. After decades of neglect, it was impossible to see the old structures that were buried under the plants. This reference to the well led to a lot of guesswork. What had been thrown away? That way? Documents, valuables, or something related to the pack that was talked about in the previous pages were stolen. There were so many options that none of them led anywhere in the end. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without knowing how many pieces were missing or what the picture should look like when it was finished. We do know that something very different happened in that family between the end of 1899 and the beginning of 1900. The mood of the diary changed completely. Things that had been entered before, thoughtful and descriptive, it became urgent, almost desperate. The author wrote about having to make quick decisions, running out of time, and not being able to keep going the way things were. There was a strong feeling that a crisis was about to happen, and that nothing could be done to stop it. One very confusing entry from February 1900 talked about visits at night, but it wasn't clear if these visits were real or made up. The text went back and forth between. There are both specific descriptions of sounds and movements and more general thoughts about guilt and punishment. There are several ways to look at these passages, as signs of mental decline, as an attempt at literary expression of inner conflicts, or as a true account of events the author couldn't logically explain. Case researchers have found similarities between this case and other historical records from the same time period. Late in the 1800s, America's society went through a lot of big changes. the Civil War's wounds. They were still hurt. The economy was changing because of industrialization, and many rural families felt like they were moving around more and more in a world they didn't recognize. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from the time often talked about this feeling of loss and being lost. The Holloway family's pain wasn't unique, but the way they talked about it was very powerful. Another interesting thing was that there was no mention of friendships or other social relationships. The diary didn't talk about neighbors or town. Events like parties, get-togethers, or community celebrations. It was like the family didn't have any friends or family around. At the time, rural communities relied heavily on networks of mutual support to stay alive, so this was very unusual. Families worked together on the harvest, traded services, and planned religious events. But the Hollways seemed to be set apart on purpose from everything else. The fact that they chose to be alone made people wonder what they were hiding. People who spend a lot of time alone usually have reasons to do that. They could be running away from something, keeping a secret, or just not being able to handle being around other people normally. The diary didn't give clear answers, but the underlying tone suggested a mix of shame, fear, and hurt pride. It was as if the family knew their reputation was at risk and would rather be alone than be shamed in public. A group of anthropologists from Duke University went to the site in 1967 as part of a study of abandoned Appalachian rural communities. They took pictures, what was left of the property, took samples of the soil, and talked to older residents. Their report confirmed that people had lived in the area, but it didn't explain why the family went missing or prove the most disturbing parts of the diary. Anthropologists did notice, though, that the story stuck in people's memories. Many years later, people still talked about the Holloways in a way that made them feel both curious and uneasy. There was something in the story that refused to fade away and kept resonating, passing down the years. It could be because the story dealt with universal issues like loneliness, family secrets, the weight of the past, and the fragility of society, or it could just be because mysteries that haven't been solved tend to stay in people's minds. The diary's literary quality was what made the Holloway case so interesting. It wasn't a piece of writing by someone who wasn't smart. The author used a lot of different words, complicated grammar, and showed that they knew their way around classical literature by mentioning works and authors from time to time. This meant that at least one family member had gone to school, which wasn't common for landowners in that area and at that time. Researchers were interested in this apparent contradiction between being intellectually sophisticated and being very socially isolated. People with education usually looked for friends, joined literary or social groups, and kept up with letters. But there was no proof that the Holloways did any of these things. It seemed like they were choosing to live a life more like that of hermits instead of settled farmers, going against the social norms of their class and education. In December 1899, the author wrote one of the most philosophical parts of the diary. It was about the nature of truth and memory. People have different ideas about whether what happened in the past can be changed by how we remember it, whether reality is objective or just a shared construction, and whether we can avoid facts or they always catch up with us. These were deep questions, like the kinds you'd find in novels or philosophical works, not in farmers' diaries. Because of this, some scholars thought that the diary might actually be a work of fiction that was written on purpose. Maybe a writer who is frustrated is using the diary form to tell a story. But there were issues with this theory. First, the metal box that the diary was found in had been buried under dirt for decades, and didn't look like it had been put there last week. Second, the information about history and geography was too exact to happen by chance. Third, it wasn't clear what the point was of making such a complicated hoax and then leaving it in a broken-down house. Most people thought that the person who wrote the diary was actually writing down his experiences and thoughts, but from a point of view that was becoming more and more troubled. Long periods of being alone, problems with family, and maybe even money issues could have made the writer imagine a different reality. What doesn't make sense or seems supernatural in the pages of a diary could be a skewed account of everyday events. For instance, the sounds that the diary kept writing about at night could have been made by wild animals, wood shrinking as the temperature changes, or just the wind. The presences that were felt could be signs of anxiety and paranoia. The scary things found in the basement could have been normal things that were seen in a scary way by a mind that was under a lot of stress. Even though these explanations made sense, the question of what happened to the family still stood. Based on records from the county, no death certificates were made for anyone in the Holloway family after 1900. No records of trips, property sales, or document transfers were found. It looked like they had just disappeared. Some people go missing on purpose and take on new identities in faraway places. That being said, it would have taken a lot of planning and money to do that to a whole family in a time before modern IDs. There was also a chance that something terrible had happened, took place on the property. A fire that started by accident, a fall, or a sudden illness, but there was no physical proof of any of these things. The house was still standing when it was left empty, but it was falling apart naturally. There were no fires, buildings that had fallen down, or other signs of a sudden disaster. The house looked like it had been left empty, like the people who lived there had gone for a walk and never came back. The family was forced to leave, which is a theory that isn't talked about as much but is just as likely. Banks, enemies, or even. The government could have made it so that the only choice was to leave everything behind and disappear. The diary talked about inherited debts, family duties, and the feeling of being stuck in situations that you can't change. It's possible that these weren't metaphors, but rather literal accounts of real pressures from outside sources. At that time, there was a fair amount of violence in the North Carolina area. Land disputes often turned into fights with weapons. Families were kicked off their land by organized groups. Law enforcement wasn't always good, and a lot of crimes were never properly looked into. If the Holloways had been in a fight like this, they might have decided it was safer to run away than to deal with the consequences. But there were no direct threats from outside sources in the diary. There were no names of the bad guys, descriptions of the fights, or cries for help. If the family was under pressure from outside sources, the author chose not to make that clear. But the text was mostly about moral and spiritual issues, internal conflicts, and a sense of fate that couldn't be changed that came from inside, not outside. This lack of clarity was probably the most frustrating and interesting thing about the case. There were many possible interpretations for each clue. For every fact that was proven, dozens of theories were born. It was not possible to finish the circle or come to a clear decision. And maybe it was this impossibility that kept the story alive, that made researchers come back to the diary over and over again, hoping to find something that all, the ones before, had missed. In 1978, an unexpected find brought the Holloway case back into people's minds. A dealer in antiques in Asheville, North Carolina, bought some old papers at an estate sale. There were 3 letters addressed to the Holloway family among the useless papers, business cards, and worn-out receipts. It had never been done to the letters. There were different senders from different states on each envelope, and they were all sealed with 1899 postage stamps. How this group of papers got here was a mystery in and of itself, but the fact that they existed showed that the Hollways were still connected to the outside world in some way, which was different from what the diary said about how isolated they seemed. When the antiques dealer thought about how important it might be historically, he called the North Carolina Historical Society. Professional conservators were there to make sure that the letters were opened carefully. It was enlightening, but it also made me wonder more than it answered. The first letter was from A. A lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, is writing about an inheritance case that is still open. It talked about disputed lands, lost documents during the war, and the urgent need to show up in person to settle legal issues. Even though it was a formal tone, there was a hint of impatience. Like this wasn't the first time the lawyer had tried to get in touch with him. The second letter was not at all like the first one. This message was sent from a woman in Charleston, South Carolina, and it felt very personal and close. She called the Holloway's wife by her first name, asked how she was doing, and talked about happy memories they both had. But there was a sadness in the writing that was deeper than that. The sender was worried about the long period of silence and asked why her previous letters had not been answered. She begged for some sign that everything was okay. It was the kind of writing that close friends would send to each other, but it had an emotional weight that suggested growing distance and a weakening bond. It was hard to figure out the third letter. It was from a man who... He only said that he was a former business partner of the Holloway patriarch. There was only a post office box in Baltimore, Maryland, for a return address. It was hard to understand because it talked about unfinished business, agreements that had to be kept, and what would happen if promises were broken. Even though there were no direct threats, it was clear what they were trying to say. People had hopes that weren't met, and someone was demanding payment. These letters told a much more complicated story of the Holloway situation better than the diary could by itself. They weren't choosing to live alone on their land and be peaceful. They were people with a lot of outside obligations, like complicated legal matters, long-distance relationships, and maybe even financial or business obligations that they had to run away from. Isolation wasn't a philosophical choice. It might have been a way to get away. In the letter, the lawyer specifically mentioned Virginia land that had belonged to Holloway ancestors. Researchers followed up on this lead and found records of a large farm in Henrico County that had been taken away during the Civil War because of unpaid debts and alleged support for the Confederacy. When the war was over, the family tried to get it back, but the court process took decades. By 1899, it looked like there was a real chance of getting the confiscation revoked, but the person would have to be present, testify, and probably pay a lot of money for legal fees. This new information shed new light on the parts of the diary that talk about inheritance and family history, duty to do. These weren't vague or spiritual ideas. They were very real legal issues. The family was stuck because they wanted to get back land they had lost, but couldn't or wouldn't go through the steps needed to do so. They might not have had the money to do it. Maybe the person felt bad about losing the property in the first place. Or maybe they just didn't think that justice would be done. The letter from the woman in Charleston led to a new line of inquiry. Who was she? What did she have to do with the Holloway's wife? Researchers looked through Charleston records, but the name was common, and a lot of people could have had it. It was clear that Holloway's wife had a social life and friends she had before she got married, but those relationships had slowly died down. The letter made it seem like the friend had tried to stay in touch but was consistently ignored, indicating that the friend did not feel the same way. This made me wonder about how things work in the household. Was she forced to be alone, or did she choose this path on her own? The author of the diary was never made clear. The handwriting was always the same, which pointed to a single person, but the writing sometimes seemed to come from different points of view. Some researchers thought that more than one family member had helped, but one person was still in charge of making sure that everything was transcribed correctly. The third letter, from the alleged business partner, was the most troubling. The language was careful not to include details that could have caused confusion. Not directly blame the sender, but it did imply some kind of joint venture that went badly. It was interesting to hear about Baltimore because in the late 1800s, it was a major trading hub with links to both the North and the South. There was a chance that the Holloway patriarch had been involved in more business than his small farm showed. Researchers tried to find business records from Baltimore from the late 1890s, but it was a huge job. There were a lot of businesses in the city. Records had been lost or thrown away over time. Some papers suggested putting money into railroad transportation. Others brought up the lumber business, but nothing that proved the Hollow name was connected. It was possible that the patriarch had used a different name for business. This is common for people who want to keep their personal life separate from their work life. These letters showed that the Holloways weren't strangers or people who didn't have any connections. They were people who had. They had complicated pasts, relationships, debts, and maybe even secrets they wanted to keep hidden. They might have tried to start over in North Carolina by being alone there, getting away from everything that was bothering them. But the diary showed that it's hard to get away from the past. It can catch up with us even in the mountains that are far away. When the letters were found, they brought up another disturbing question. How many other letters would have been lost in the same way that these 3 were? How many times had attempts to get in touch been turned down? The most important question was why the letters had not been opened. Had the family left before they could get them, or had they chosen not to open them because they knew what was inside? The letters were still around and found in a stack of papers many years later, which meant that someone had kept them, even if they hadn't read them. Someone had a goal, but what was it? A documentary filmmaker working on their own tried to make a movie about the case in 1982. It was his trip to North Carolina, filmed the site of the old estate, talked to local historians, and tried to piece together the Holloways' lives through their pictures. The project was never finally done. The documentary filmmaker said they were having unspecified technical problems, their equipment kept breaking, and they felt generally uneasy working with the material. Some crew members quit the project without giving a good reason. The little video that was taken was kept in private archives and was never shown to the public. This added to the stories about the case. People started to talk about curses, things that shouldn't be touched, and negative energy that wouldn't go away. But these were easy ways to explain things that probably had less interesting causes. There are many practical and financial reasons why documentary projects fail all the time. When things break, people give up. There was no need to call on the supernatural, but it was amazing how certain patterns kept happening. The property was still not owned. Problems came up with research projects. Signs of came to the surface and then went away again. It seemed like the case actively refused to be solved, as if there was something, maybe just chance, that was trying to keep the mystery alive. The case went from being a real event to a story that people told to scare each other over time. It went from being a mystery that could be solved to a story that people told to each other. New tools and technologies for studying history came out in the 1990s. Digitized databases started to appear, which made it possible to compare information that it would not have been possible before. A group of amateur genealogists who were interested in the Holloway case chose to use these tools to try to find out what happened to the family. They learned new things and were scared by what they found. They were able to confirm that the family lived in North Carolina in the 1880s and 1890s by looking at census records. There were entries that said the patriarch owned land and was the right age, which matched what the diary said. His wife and other people were in the records, members of the family, but there were some problems. In some censuses, the names of people who don't show up later are listed. In others, the family structure changes for no clear reason. It looked like the family wasn't stable because people came and went from the house without leaving any clear signs. From tax records, an especially interesting find was made. The Holloway property kept showing up until 1899 with regular payments. But there was a gap in 1900. It was not taxed, when people from the county tried to. Gather, the property was discovered empty. At that time, administrative records show that someone looked for heirs or guardians, but no one showed up. The land was eventually given back to the county because taxes had not been paid in a long time. What stood out was how accurate the time was. The family left just as the diary ended in the spring of 1900. There wasn't a space of months or years. It looked like the last entry in the diary happened at the same time they left the house. This synchronicity made me feel uneasy. It seemed like the author knew something important was going to happen, that these were the last pages of not only the diary but also a part of their lives. Genealogists also learned something new about the distant relative who was written about in the diary. There was a record of a man named Holloway who lost things in a fire in Caldwell County in 1898. He was listed in records for public assistance right after the disaster, but then he was no longer there. The order of events was exactly the same as in the diary. Report of someone coming to the property after losing everything. But there was no proof that this person actually moved in. It was just a coincidence of timing. Travel records were looked at in a different line of inquiry. If the family had moved to a different area, they might have left clues in the train, stagecoach, or in logs. There was a train station in the town closest to the Holloway estate that linked the area to bigger cities. Researchers looked through passenger lists kept in railroad archives, but couldn't find any entries with the name Holloway at the time in question. It is possible to travel under fake names, but this would need to be planned and would show that the person was trying to get away, not just going missing. Also, there were things to think about. When the property was checked out by the police in 1900, they found clothes, furniture, and other household items that were still in their original places. It was like the family had taken a trip and then decide not to come back. People who want to leave for good often take things that are valuable, important papers, and things that are special to you. But it looks like the Hollways either didn't do this or did and then changed everything to make it look like someone left quickly. Both options were just as unsettling. Reports from the time said that the kitchen table was set up as if someone was getting ready to serve a meal. The dishes and silverware were clean and in order, and the tablecloth looked like it had just been put down, based on the descriptions. In this case, the abandonment happened quickly, maybe while the meal was being made. Why did they stop talking so quickly? Was there an emergency, a threat, or just the decision that now was the time and there was no reason to wait? In 1996, a graduate student in psychology chose to look at the diary from the point of view of a clinical researcher. She was interested in how patterns in writing could show how people were feeling. Even though her research wasn't able to come to a conclusion, it did find linguistic markers that are linked to extreme stress and maybe even depression. The noise level. Some words, the way the sentences were put together, and the way the tone changed from beginning to end of the document all pointed to a gradual decline in the author's mental health. She also noticed patterns of dissociation, times when the author used detached and impersonal language to talk about events as if she were an outsider. This happens a lot to people who have been through a traumatic event or long-term stress. It's a way for their minds to protect themselves by separating themselves from the present moment in order to handle it better. If the interpretations were right, the person who wrote the diary was going through a lot of pain, and the references to things and people that couldn't be explained could have been signs of this pain. That being said, the student also found passages that were incredibly clear and well-written, showing logical thinking and the ability to think critically. This wasn't a document made by someone who was totally lost and crazy. It came from a smart mind that was fighting against tough conditions and trying to. keep things under control even when things looked like they were going wrong. This duality made the diary even more moving because it showed that it was aware of how it was falling apart. Researchers were still interested in the Virginia inheritance issue. If the family had a real chance of getting back valuable things, why didn't they try? The lawyer's letter said that the person had to be there in person, which would require a lot of travel and cost a lot of money. It's possible that they just didn't have the resources. But there was one more possibility. What if they didn't want to get the property back because it would put them in the spotlight? Going to court would be the last thing they would want if they were trying to hide something. Some researchers think this could be a sign of criminal activity. The letter from the supposed business partner in Baltimore used language that made it sound like they were up to no good. What if there was something illegal going on in the hallways? At that time, people often smuggled things. Theft of documents, fraud, or any of these. Activities could explain the feeling of being alone, the fear of being seen, and the need to disappear completely in the end. But these ideas were still just guesses. There was no solid proof of wrongdoing. There were only hints, interpretations of vague language, and a general feeling that something was being kept secret. The issue with old mysteries is that there isn't much proof, so there's more room for guesswork. Though guesswork is useful, it can't replace facts. The county finally chose to sell the land in 2003, where the whole property used to be. There was a public auction that was properly advertised. A few people who were interested showed up, mostly real estate developers who were thinking about building vacation homes in the area in the future. But when the history of the land, including the Holloway case, became public, people became less interested. There was an auction, but not many people bid. A local investor bought it for a lot less than what it was worth on the market, probably more as a long-term bet than to use it right away. A few times, the new owner went to the site, always there with them. He said there wasn't anything special about it. It was just a dense forest like all the others in the area. He didn't feel any strange presences or have any strange experiences. All he saw were plants and the occasional wild animal. For him, it was just land that was worth something based on what could be built on it. The Hollow story was interesting, but it was just history. There were big changes in how historical information was shared and kept safe with the start of the new century. All of the web. People who are interested in unsolved mysteries can now form communities where they can share theories, digital documents, and work together on investigations that would not have been possible before. People from all over the world naturally talked about the Holloway case in these places, where hundreds of people broke it down, debated it, and came up with new ways to understand it. In 2007, a very helpful conversation on an online forum about American history led to a surprising discovery. Someone who took part was inexperienced. A genealogist decided not to look into the holes directly but into the families who lived on nearby properties. It was easy to see why. If the holes had mysteriously vanished, their neighbors might have known something that had never been properly recorded. What he found were a bunch of strange coincidences. Between 1900 and 1902, 3 families who lived on land near the Holloways also left the area. They didn't leave as quickly, but they all sold their land and moved to other parts of the country. One family moved to Oregon, another to Texas, and the third just stopped being listed after selling the house. Land registry records show that when buyers asked the sellers why they were selling, they all vaguely said that the area was no longer useful for their purposes. It wasn't unusual for so many people to leave a certain rural area at once. A lot of people moved around to find better opportunities, but the timing seemed off. And when the genealogist found, he learned that at least 2 of these families had lived in the area for many generations. They were well-established families with deep roots, the kind of families that wouldn't normally leave ancestral lands without a good reason. He found the children and grandchildren of one of these families in Oregon. He got in touch with an old woman by email whose great-grandmother had been part of the family that left North Carolina. The woman told stories that had been told for a long time. Her great-grandmother had told stories that had been passed down through the generations, but had never been written down or officially recorded. And these stories talked about the Holloway family. According to the story that was passed down orally, this woman's great-grandmother remembered the Holloways as a strange family that kept their distance from everyone. But it wasn't just being alone. There was more than that. The great-grandmother said she saw lights in the hallway at odd times. These weren't normal lamplights. They were something else, pulsed in a strange way. She also said that at night, she heard sounds coming from that direction. They weren't screams or other loud noises, but what she called chanting or rhythmic murmurs that echoed through the forest. The most interesting part of the oral history was about the days before the person went missing. The great-grandmother said that there was strange activity in the hallway. It was very unusual for people to be coming and going. She wasn't able to tell who these people were because it was a long way, and they always got there at dusk, but there were carts, horses, and activity that made it look like they were getting ready for something important. After that, there was complete silence. The land was very quiet for a few days, but then, according to the great-grandmother, there was one night when the whole forest seemed restless. There were strange sounds coming from animals. Even though it was night, the birds were flying all over the place. It seemed like something in the natural order had been thrown off, according to her. It was seen that the next morning that smoke was coming from the house, but it wasn't smoke from a chimney. It was darker and thicker, like a big thing was on fire. After that, when it was clear that the hallways were gone, the family of the great-grandmother talked about what to do. Should they look into the abandoned house or call the police? But there was fear. It wasn't a well-thought-out fear of physical harm. It was something deeper and more instinctual. The grandmother described it as if everyone in the neighborhood thought the property should be left alone and didn't care about what had happened there. Even though this story couldn't be proven, it added a lot of interesting details to the case. If there had been strange activity in the past few days, it meant that plans were being made. The hallways hadn't just vanished without a trace. They were getting ready for something. Also, if things were being burned, what were they destroying? Things, papers, and proof of. They didn't want to be found out about. The fact that more than one person was seen at the property was also important. This went against the idea of being completely alone. It looked like the hallways were linked, because people came to them even when they were alone. Who were these people? Extended family, business partners, or something more sinister, as suggested by the great-grandmother's vague and unsettling descriptions? In 2010, a professor of history wrote an article that went over everything that was known about the case. So he said, is that a lot of the mystery surrounding the holes was added later. Over decades, layers of interpretation and guesswork were added until they made it hard to see what the real facts were. His main point was that families from the country often went missing around the turn of the century, and that most of the time it was because they wanted to start over somewhere else, were in debt, or were having legal problems. He also had doubts about some parts of the diary's truthfulness. He did not say it was a complete fake, but they said that some parts might have been improved or added later. He said that the consistent handwriting didn't prove that the author was the only one who wrote it because people could copy other people's writing styles on purpose. Also, he said that the most dramatic parts of the diary, like the references to pacts and supernatural beings, might not be true events, but rather an attempt to write an interesting story. The article caused a heated debate among people who study the case. Some people agreed that it was made up and romanticized too much. Others said that ignoring the most upsetting parts of the diary was intellectually dishonest and an attempt to fit the case into easy-to-understand categories, when the truth might be more complicated and unsettling than these categories allow. People who talk about the Hollways have always been torn between being logically skeptical and being open to less common possibilities. Some people saw nothing more than a troubled family trying to get out of debt and making up their own diary drama. Having fun. There were also people who thought something really strange had happened, something that didn't fit into the usual categories of what happened in history. The North Carolina Historical Society finally scanned the whole diary and put it online for researchers to use in 2012. This was the first time that a lot of people could see the document. A lot of people downloaded the pictures and used tools that hadn't been around for decades to look at the handwriting and the text. Linguists looked at writing. Patterns. Experts in historical documents looked at the paper and ink. Psychologists gave their opinions on how the author was feeling mentally. Most people agreed that the diary was real, that it was written by a real person going through hard times, and that it was from the time period given. But people still had different ideas about what those circumstances were. Was it mental distress that was made worse by being alone? Was it a response to real, everyday pressures from the outside? And were there parts of the Holloways? Experience that just couldn't be put into the right category or explained properly. The text was looked at by a computer, which found some interesting patterns. Throughout the diary, the number of times certain words were used steadily increased. More and more often, words that meant darkness, silence, heaviness, and duty showed up. At the same time, words that talked about hope, the future, and possibilities got progressively fewer. It was a language map of growing hopelessness, an objective record of how the author's view was narrowing until he saw no way for him to get out of it. In 2015, a group of college history students decided to go to the site as part of a project to record North Carolina's abandoned historic sites. They had modern cameras, recorders, and GPS with them. They wanted to make a visual and physical record of the area by drawing a map of where the property had been and how the land had changed over more than 100 years. They found a thick forest that was almost impossible to get through in some places, utilizing historical records. With the help of old maps, they were able to get a good idea of where the house was. Some of the stones looked like they might have been part of the foundation, but they were so covered in moss and plants that it was impossible to be sure. With metal detectors, they found a few things, mostly rusty nails and pieces of farm tools, but nothing very interesting. However, one of the students, who had read a lot about the case, was determined to find the person who was talked about in the diary. Using maps and descriptions of the terrain from the By looking at the entries, he thought about where the well might be. After hours of looking, they finally found a round depression in the ground that was deeper than the soil around it. Even though it was completely covered in plants, the shape was clear. It was not a natural formation. It was man-made. They carefully cleaned up the area and made sure it was really an old well. Some rocks and dirt had filled in the hole over time, but they could still see down into. The darkness. They didn't have the right gear to safely go down or explore the depths, but they were able to lower a camera with a bright light on a long cable. The pictures they were able to find showed a well that was at least 15 meters deep and had well-built stone walls around it. The water at the bottom was dark and still, but they couldn't see much further because their gear wasn't very good and it was so deep. The things they saw were proof that the well existed, was big, and was right where the journal said. This proved another part of the document to be factually correct in a way that can be checked. The discovery of the long-running debate about what might have been thrown away there, as mentioned in the diary pages. The students told the Historical Society about what they had found, and it was talked about whether the site could be explored in a more thorough and professional way. But this was hard to do because of practical and financial issues. Taking water out of or exploring an abandoned well. Finding something that was more than 100 years old would take a lot of work, and there was no guarantee that anything useful would be found. Any organic matter had probably been broken down by time and plants, and metal objects would have rusted completely. What was more important was the moral question. There had to be a reason why something was hidden in that well. Bringing up secrets that someone had worked so hard to hide raised a lot of moral questions. Should people honor the intentions of the dead? Or does looking for the truth about the past justify disturbing things that were meant to be kept secret? There were no easy answers to these questions, and the academic community stayed divided. At the same time, the diary's availability online had made people all over the world interested in the case. There are blogs that are only about the Hollways, podcasts that talk about theories. There were even groups that set up site visits. The landowner was at first tolerant, but the attention started to bother him. There were people there, people wandering around the property without being invited. Some are even trying to dig or look for artifacts. He finally put up signs saying private property and said he would sue people who broke the rules. It wasn't just the Holloway case where people wanted to know about a historical mystery and private property rights clashed. It happened in places where scary stories have been told about crimes that happened there in the past. For some reason, people are interested in mysteries and want to be in places where strange things have happened. Being close could help show understanding in a way that words alone can't. In 2017, a nonfiction author said she was writing a full-length book about the Holloway case. She had been doing research for 3 years, going to different state archives and talking to the children and grandchildren of people who used to live in the area to try to find any clues about what happened to the family. The book said it would be the last word on the subject by putting together all the evidence that was known and adding new information that the author said they had found. When the book came out in 2019, it made a big splash among people who were interested in the case. The author had really done great work. There were more records she found that supported some parts of the diary. She went to the Virginia archives and found papers that explained the inheritance process that were mentioned in the lawyer's letter. These papers proved that there was, in fact, a lot of property at stake. The Charleston letter was also found, and its likely sender was identified as a woman from a well-known family who had been in school with the Holloway's wife. But the most important discovery was made in the ports of Baltimore. The author found a ship's manifest from April 1900 that had a list of people going to South America. 3 of the names were vaguely similar to people in the Holl family, though the last names were slightly different. The ages were also pretty close. An accident of names wasn't proof, but the timing, the number of people involved, and the similarity of the names all pointed in that direction. If this idea is true, the Holloways wouldn't have just vanished. They just ran away, changed their names, and started over on a different continent. In this way, we can understand why they were never found in the U.S., why they left everything behind, and why the last entries in the diary felt so final. They weren't being taken by strange things. They were following a carefully thought-out plan to get away. But this explanation, even though it made sense, didn't answer all of my questions. Why? So far, people often moved because they were in debt or had legal problems, but only to another state or continent. In the early 1900s, South America wasn't an easy place to visit. It cost a lot, took a long time, and was dangerous. It would take a lot of money, which the family probably didn't have since they were probably running away from creditors. The author thought it's possible that the Holloways have resources that are hidden. Maybe the business they did with their partner in Baltimore made them money that they didn't tell anyone about. Maybe they sold something valuable in secret before they left. The diary talked about things that were inherited. maybe family heirlooms that could be sold without anyone getting suspicious. This makes sense because of the references to inheritance and family duties, not just land, but also valuable things that can be moved around. Some people who didn't like the book said that the whole South American escape theory was based on weak evidence. Similar names on a ship's manifest did not prove who they were. A huge number of people. At that time, people traveled between continents, and name coincidences happened all the time without any further proof in South American records or documents definitively linking those passengers to the North Carolina Holloways. It was still just an interesting possibility, not a proven fact. In South America, the author tried to follow this lead by going to Argentina and Brazil, where the ship had docked, but finding specific people in countries more than 100 years later. With broken historical records and millions of newcomers, it was almost impossible. In old records, she found a few last names that were similar, but nothing that proved it. When the trail went cold, there was nothing left to think about. The psychological and social situation at the time was also looked at in great detail in the book. The author said that many American families were under a lot of stress in the late 1800s. Things were falling apart in the old order. There were changes in the economy and society, and people who had done well under the old system, they were forced to move and were vulnerable. The Holloways would have found this change especially painful because they came from a family that lost a lot of money and status in the Civil War. In this view, the diary wasn't seen as a record of supernatural events or occult crimes. Instead, it was seen as a psychological record of people dealing with losing their social identity. The references to family pacts and duties were meant to show the weight of unmet family expectations. When it gets dark, being present was a sign of guilt and anxiety. Being alone was both a way to protect themselves and a response to social shame. Reading the document in a more human way made the Holloways seem less like mysterious figures and more like real people with problems that everyone can relate to. That being said, not everyone agreed with this read. Some readers thought the author was putting modern psychological ideas on events that might have been really different. Because we can explain. Looking at something through the lens of psychology doesn't mean that it's always the right or full explanation. The inner lives of people in the past were complex and can't be summed up in modern analytical terms. In 2020, during the pandemic, when many people were stuck at home alone, people became interested in the Holloway case again. Many people who had been forced to be alone could relate to parts of the diary, like the descriptions of endless days locked up and the sense of time passing. Specifically, the mental effects of being cut off from community. All of this hit home in a new way for readers who were feeling alone in their own ways. A lot of people talked about the case online. People talked about being alone and how it affected their mental health, drawing comparisons to what the author of the diary wrote. People understood that being alone for a long time can change how you see the world, and that when you're stressed, your mind makes up stories to make you feel better, make sense of things that would otherwise be unbearable. For many, the whole diary wasn't just a mystery from the past. It was also a reflection of their own problems in the present. Different points of view came with this new wave of interest. True crime and historical mystery podcasters went back to the case and used modern tools to tell the story. Some talked about the investigative parts, others about the psychological parts, and still others talked about more hypothetical ideas about what might have happened. The different approaches showed how. There wasn't just one way to look at the case. Different people told different stories which led to different interpretations. One of these podcasts did something really cool. Through a lot of genealogical research and the use of DNA databases, the host found a possible descendant of the Holloway's neighbors, the same family whose story had been told over the phone years before. He found out that there were more stories that had been told down through the years, but had never been written down. Out there. These extra stories made the picture more complicated. They said that the whole family was looked at with a mix of trust and respect. Respect them because they were smart and seemed to come from a wealthy family. Distrust because they kept clear secrets and wouldn't join in with the community normally. Some people also said that the patriarch had been in a duel years before in another state and had run away to North Carolina to avoid the consequences. This would add a whole new level. In the late 1800s, most states made duels illegal, but they still happened. Men from certain social classes who thought honor was more important than the law often did them. If the Holloway patriarch had killed or hurt someone in a duel and then run away, that would explain why he was alone and scared of being found out. That would also explain why he didn't want to be a part of the court case in Virginia, where he might have caused new inquiries into the duel. The talk about the duel. Researchers are going to look at newspaper records from states where these kinds of fights happened more often in the last 10 years. Even after they were made illegal, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee all had a history of duels. In Virginia, newspaper archives, they found a story about a man whose last name might be related to the Holloways and something that happened in 1891. Only that there had been a battle of honor between two men that had led to injuries was written in the short article. Apparently, one of the men had already left the state before the police could properly question him. There was no proof that this man was the whole patriarch for sure, but the timing made sense. He would have had almost 10 years to start over before the events of 1900 if he had left Virginia in 1891 and moved to North Carolina soon after. And if he was always afraid that his past would catch up with him, that would explain his paranoia in the diary pages and his refusal to talk about it. With the police, and finally his choice to disappear completely when pressure from outside sources got too much for him to handle. With this possible explanation, the Holloway story went from being a supernatural mystery to a very human tragedy. A man trying to get away from the attention of his mistakes and rebuild his life, but he can't quite get away from the weight of what he did. There's a family that wants to live a normal life but also wants to be loyal to the patriarch. And finally, when all the pressures came together, the choice to leave everything behind and disappear. They might go to South America, as the book's author suggested. Or they might go somewhere else that is still unknown. But some people said that this explanation, while useful, might have been too simple. The diary was too complicated to be boiled down to a man running away from a violent past. There were discussions about inheritance, long-standing family arguments, and duties that went beyond a single person. More than one thing could have been at play. At the same time, that reality was more complicated than any one theory could explain. The power of the diary as a record can't be argued with. It doesn't matter what happened, we have proof of a real person struggling with terrible conditions, trying to stay sane in a situation that was getting worse, and finally finding a way out that meant giving up everything they knew. It shows how fragile people are, and how quickly the things that make up everyday life can fall apart. Crumble when put under enough stress. More than 120 years after the Holloways went missing, the place where they lived is still mostly the same. The forest has taken back the area, leaving almost no physical evidence that they were there. Hidden by plants, the well is still there, holding secrets that may never be revealed. Over the years, the land has been owned by different people several times, but no one has ever built anything permanent there. It's like the place doesn't want to start over and would rather stay a quiet reminder of something that was and will never be again. The diary is still kept safe in the archives of the North Carolina Historical Society, and any researcher can look it up if they want to. The pages are fragile now, more than 100 years after they were written, but you can still read the words. Any generation that reads them comes up with their own ideas, interpretations, and ways of getting what the author was trying to say. And maybe that's how it should be. Mysteries don't always need to be solved in order to be useful. It's not always important to have the right answer. Sometimes what we learn while trying to understand something is more important. The Hollow case makes us think of all the stories that haven't been told yet, and the lives that have been lived and lost without proper records being kept. We're lucky to have the diary, even though it has a lot of problems and unclear parts. It shows a world that doesn't exist anymore, and people who deeply felt and suffered, and who had to deal with moral and practical problems they couldn't solve. Satisfactory resolution. They are people just like us, separated only by time, and they are dealing with problems that seem surprisingly modern. The diary's questions are still important. How do we deal with secrets from the past when the responsibilities we inherited become too much to bear? How far are we willing to go to keep the people we love safe? How do we stay sane when we're cut off from everyone else? These aren't questions about the past. These problems have always been there for people, and each generation faces them in slightly different but fundamental ways. In the same ways, things may never be the same again for the Holloway family. Maybe they really did sail to South America and lived the rest of their lives with different names. When they died and were buried in a different country, no one knew who they were. Maybe something even worse happened, and no one will ever know about it because they haven't seen it. There may be more than one way to find the truth, or the truth may be somewhere in the middle of all the theories. What we can do, say for sure, is that the Holloways were there. They lived in the late 1800s on a remote farm in the mountains of North Carolina. They had hard times that made them pull away from their neighbors and the community. They had to deal with pressures from inside and outside that got too much for them to handle. And sometime in the spring of 1900, they made a choice that erased them from normal historical records for good. All that was left were ruins, rumors, and an amazing diary that people still read today. Fascinate and bother everyone who reads it. The property where everything happened is still there, a silent witness to what happened that it can never say. Fields that were once farmed are now full of trees. The mountains are still being blown through by the wind. Locals say that when the fog gets thick at dusk, it's sometimes possible to picture what it was like for a family who lived there over 100 years ago and wrote about their pain on pages that would be read by future generations. If this story interested you as much as, leave a comment telling us what you think the Holloways' real lives were like. If you want to see more investigations into disturbing historical mysteries that can't be explained easily, subscribe to the channel. And if you liked what you read, clicking like will help more people find these important stories that have been forgotten. Until the next trip through the darks of the